I really love this place. The smells and the sounds, particularly at daybreak, are absolutely magical. It's a real bit of primeval wilderness. And the great thing is it's right on my doorstep. It's the perfect place to start a day's walk. You can find places like this all over Britain. Wild places where nature has moved in after industries left for pastures new. I want to walk you around 4 or 5 miles of a particular bit of the Black Country that I know very well. It's a mile or two from where I live in Stourbridge, and I think it's rather special. My walk actually starts in this old clay pit, right in the heart of Dudley. I must say these old industrial landscapes seem to be my natural habitat. I was born and brought up in Sheffield, catching tadpoles and building dams in the river valleys there. And for the past 15 years or so, I've worked as a landscape architect here in the Midlands. These urban landscapes are terrific for wildlife. They're just so much less polluted than the chemically sprayed farming landscapes of the rural countryside these days. It's a real oasis, this, completely surrounded by factories, houses, and of course thousands of people. The thing that makes this place so exciting, from my point of view anyway, is that it's entirely man-made. If local people hadn't made such a terrible mess of the place 150 years ago, there would never have been a great big hole for nature to move back into and colonise and turn into this lost landscape that's so full of wildlife. And you can see the evidence of people all around you in this sort of industrial landscape. Even the apple tree behind me is evidence that once upon a time there were people active here. And it's within living memory that the ponies used to line up just here to drag the clay out of the clay pit to cart away to the canals to turn into lavatory basins. And the other thing about this sort of industrial derelict sort of landscape is that it was never exploited very efficiently, so it's really a mosaic of lots of little pockets of ancient relic landscape as well. There are little pockets of marshland, little pockets of meadow, and the odd woodland too. And those areas have been able to provide reservoirs of wildlife to move back in when man's finished exploiting the land. That scramble up from the clay pit's about the most strenuous bit of my walk. It's a nice, easy downhill stroll from that relatively new quarry landscape to a much older woodland just a couple of 100 yards away. It's easy to see why nature's been able to do such a marvellous job of reclaiming the clay pit. Just a couple of minutes flying time for jays and they can carry acorns from this marvellous ancient woodland and begin to replant the landscape. And this is a fantastic sort of reservoir for wildlife. It's been here for 8,000 years since the last ice age, and somehow it's managed to survive mining and factories and all sorts of other upheavals. So it's typical of the sort of fragments of ancient landscape which have provided a reservoir to recolonise the relics of old industrial dereliction. Ancient landscapes like this are quite irreplaceable from the wildlife point of view. But of course they're also very important from the social point of view. Local people have always had a very close relationship with this sort of landscape. They've always walked through it, they've always picked bluebells in it, collected firewood from it, and generally known about the place, had an intimate sort of relationship. And it's really only in the last 20 or 30 years that that situation has turned a little bit sour. It's in the last few years that vandalism has begun to increase, and this wood is a very good example of that. There's been serious abuse of it in the last 10 or 15 years, perhaps. For instance, it's only in the last few years that people have thought to set fire to the base of a tree. It's just a nice place to have a picnic, come out, chop a few young saplings down, pile them up at the base of a big oak tree and set fire to it. And people simply don't understand anymore, because they've lost touch with the place, that doing that on one Sunday morning is enough to kill this tree, which might have been here for 150 years and might have had another 150 years to go, and it'll die over the next 10 or 15 years. Fortunately, the local authority has now begun to do something about that, and has just begun to employ wardens, rangers, people who can work in this woodland to do two things: to rebuild the relationship between the local people and the place, and then doing the very practical thing of actually beginning to husband the place again. It really is smashing to see this lovely old woodland being managed properly at last, and lots of local people, young and employed and school children, are getting involved in just taking care of the wood. Graham, you're one of the regulars round here, a regular volunteer. Must be your day off, is it?
Yeah, I spend Saturdays, holidays and any other time off I've got.
Why do you bother?
Well, I live locally. I like the wildlife. I look upon this woodland as my own. I just enjoy it.
There's lots of you working around, crashing about in the undergrowth.
There's a couple of us working out in the field today. We're clearing the weeds from around the trees to give the trees a better chance to grow. All these trees we've planted by local helpers, and the reason why we've planted them is because of the woodland is a dying woodland, and there was a lot of grazing going on, about 50 years of it, and we're having to put in the young trees to replace the old ones.
And are people taking care of the place?
Yes, it's being taken care of better than what it was before we started.
Oh, that's great.
So
you've really seen a difference in a couple of years?
Great difference, yeah.
Nobody's pulling them up?
We've had some pulled up, but as soon as I'm pulled up, we put them back in again.
Good for you. Great. You're looking busy.
Always busy here, Pa.
Have you got 5 minutes to show me where the best bluebells are?
Yes.
You've been here, what, a couple of years now? What did you do before?
More like 3 years. Before that, I was 20 years in a iron foundry. And then 10 years in a iron works.
So that's a bit of a change.
It was a lot of a change.
And what do you spend most of your time doing? I mean, apart from just breathing deeply and enjoying the bluebells.
Well, you know, people think we do nothing, but the thing is that we're talking to people, and this is what we're all about, getting through to people.
Yeah.
Hopefully the youngsters get them to appreciate the woodland. Right? There's mostly local people, but from all the way around the areas.
Yeah. And what sort of things do they do? I mean, presumably they're here to help.
Well, you take this brush pile here.
Yeah.
It does two things. It helps to clear the wood up, and it makes a nice habitat for birds to feed in, look, and winter in, and it's a nice, that sort of thing. Rubbish of all description.
When the sun's shining, which unfortunately it isn't at the moment, but that in itself as a single plant is a very pretty form, and as I say, it has a lily-shaped leaf. In the olden days, people that lived in the countryside used to actually go foraging in the woodland to find this particular plant, and they used to use it for flavouring things like stews and casseroles. Now the correct name for that is ramson, and that's spelled R-A-M-S-O-N, but it's commonly known as wild garlic, and as I say, it grows anywhere, truthfully. It doesn't really favour special conditions, and hedgerows is a good place to find it.
Hello, Tony.
Hello, Chris. How are you?
I'll have to love you and leave you, Alan.
Cheerio.
See ya. Ta-da.
Is anybody strong enough to... Here we are then. Don't eat it all, just have a little piece each. Yes, you can all have a little taste. And you'll go home smelling of garlic or spring onions or whatever you think it might taste of. Quite nice, actually. I know she will. She won't believe you've been at Saltwells Nature Reserve.
The wardens showed over 3,000 local children around Saltwells Wood last year, and I'm certain that side of their work's helping make sure the place survives. I must say, at last, more and more local authorities are realising that these wild landscapes need caring for. You might well be thinking by now that this is just another country walk. Nothing but bluebells and birdsong so far. But in fact, we're in the heart of an industrial valley. Still, that does have its compensations. At least I can be sure of a bite to eat at lunchtime. A couple of sausage and tomato sandwiches. There you are. I'm sure you got something to stick it together with.
There you are.
That's
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This walk of mine needs all the bluebells and beech trees I can muster because somebody's taken a big bite out of the middle of my landscape. 2 years ago there were 150 acres of green fields here, right in the heart of this old industrial part of Britain. And then somebody had the brilliant idea that if you gave enough financial incentives, through enough government grants, if you removed the rates, then property developers might be attracted to build all this nonsense. The idea is that if you build new buildings, you create new jobs. But of course, we all know that in fact, they're old jobs that have moved from another building. And in fact, there are 40 million square feet of empty commercial premises just in this part of the West Midlands, standing idle. And yet here we are building new short-life buildings on what were precious green fields. What I would argue is that even with the very high level of unemployment, these buildings are not going to solve that problem. But under those circumstances, what local people desperately need is green spaces to escape into. For generations, the people who live and work in this kind of area have been used to a landscape of woods and fields and coal mines and factories, but suddenly, in the panic caused by the collapse of the traditional heavy industries, the pace and scale of change just seems to have lurched completely out of control. How would you like to have a huge open cast coal mine within a couple of 100 yards of your living room windows? Not much chance of hearing skylarks anymore. Most landscape architects seem to do nothing else but create new landscapes. I must say I seem to spend a great deal of my time battling to save old landscapes and then trying desperately to find somebody to take care of them properly. I think most people would probably agree that that's a devastated landscape, lost forever. In fact, what's happening is that the developers are digging right down, taking the old coal workings out and removing the holes effectively, so that the land will no longer settle, and then they can build new buildings on the top. Same old story. But in fact, it's rather a nicer story than usual, because having lost the main battle, having lost the 70 acres of green fields, I'm not really one to say die, and so we continued the war, if you like. Long conversations with the managing director of the development company, with the local people, with the councillors and so on, are leading to really quite an exciting scheme. Originally, the whole of the valley was to be levelled, dead flat, just a plateau of about a mile in length, with a whacking great dual carriageway through the centre of it. What's now going to happen is that the site's going to be developed on a series of plateaus. That gives us a whole series of banks. So the people in the housing estate will look at a series of banks covered in trees, hiding the buildings that eventually go onto the plateaus. And then by doing that, it means that the developer can actually conserve the stream. So from a pretty gory beginning of a devastated landscape and a whacking great hole in the ground, what's emerging is a brand new landscape, certainly, but a landscape which will allow the woodland to continue right the way through the valley, will conserve the stream, and will actually provide a very green and pleasant place in which people can live and work. And that's creative conservation. For something like 150 years now, the canals have provided the ideal way of getting around in the Black Country. No hills to climb, no roads to cross. Lovely things to grow up with, canals. In fact, I can follow one big loop of the Dudley Canal all the way up this edge of my valley, round the enterprise zone and the leafy bits of woodland that are still clinging on, and right down the other side. There's something very romantic about the redundant industrial landscapes of the last century. Everywhere you look, there are beautiful bits of brickwork and signs of that magical mixture of very hard graft and tender loving care. Modern dereliction just doesn't have the same qualities somehow. Round Oak Steelworks was suddenly closed down just a couple of years ago, throwing thousands of local people out of work and crippling the local community. It's hard to see the romance in that. Of course, this isn't just a Black Country problem. Wherever you go, in every old industrial settlement, you'll find huge areas of this sort of industrial dereliction. And that adds up to thousands and thousands of acres of land that's already been committed to industry, and heavy industry at that. And that just makes it all the more sad, I think, that we still build on green fields. We should be recycling this land first. In fact, I'd go so far as to say that in Britain we never ever need to build on another green field. We've already despoiled quite enough of the landscape for industry. We've got enough to go at forevermore. It's marvellous to think that generation after generation of black country steelworkers must have sighed a great sigh of relief when they left the clatter and bang of the foundry and were able to escape into this wonderful green, leafy little sanctuary right on the edge of the steelworks. 50 acres of rolling fields, hedgerows, banks of may blossom, bird song, just where you most need it. But sadly, it's no longer there. It's gone forever. And so future generations of black country children will never see this place in its green, beautiful form, because just a year ago, in the height of the nesting season, the machines moved into Merry Hill Farm and destroyed it forever. The local people loved Merry Hill Farm. The trouble is, they took it for granted. It's terrible to think that these kids will never ever know how beautiful it was. There are 40,000 school children within 5 miles of here. Wouldn't Merry Hill Farm have been a marvellous place to keep, so they could learn about the green side of the black country? Still, it's gone forever, and they call it progress. You'd think this much official vandalism would be more than enough for anybody. But in fact, you remember that beautiful place we started this walk? I've just learned that there is an application to fill it in. Somebody with a great deal of money owns the coal underneath the woodland next door. So the obvious thing to do is dig up the woodland, dig out the coal, throw the woodland in the clay pit and pocket the cash. Well, at least Dalton's clay pit's still here for the time being. And I must say, it's nice to be able to end my walk on a nice leafy note. We've got so much power these days to destroy things. And we can't simply keep on relying on nature to come back and heal the wounds. We've got to learn to use that power more positively, more sensitively. And if we do learn that skill, if we do learn to live with nature again, then maybe, just maybe, there'll be lovely walks like this for future generations to enjoy.